Good evening and welcome to our eighth and last talk in this term's public seminar series here at the Refugee Study Centre at Oxford University. My name is Hanno Brankamp and I'm a departmental lecturer in forced migration here at the RSC. As most of you will know, the theme for this series has been race, borders and global immobility. And the aim of the series was to better understand the violence that migrants, refugees, people on the move and other life seekers experience regularly at the hands of states and other actors across the world. And our speakers in the past 7 weeks have talked about detention, about deportation, policing, encampment, imprisonment, interceptions at sea, surveillance, abandonment, and racist immigration policies, which impact in particular people racialized as Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and in particular those from the majority world or the global South. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Maurice Steele as our speaker for today, who will be presenting on Carceral Geographies, Racial Violence, the Contested Mediterranean Border Zone. Dr. Maurice Steele is lecturer in international relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. Before, he taught at the University of Warwick and the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on migration and borders in contemporary Europe and Northern Africa, and is broadly situated in the fields of international political sociology, political geography, and migration, citizenship, and border studies. And his monograph, Migrant Resistance in Contemporary Europe, was published by Routledge in 2019. Welcome you to the RSC tonight, even though it's a little bit sad that this public seminar series is coming to a close. In terms of housekeeping, during the presentation, I would ask the audience to put down your questions in the Q&A box that you'll find down there on your Zoom screen. And at the very end of the talk, I will direct your questions at the speaker and we'll have some time for Q&A. Okay, over to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Hanno. Let me just put on the slides and I hope you can see them. If there's an issue, please let me know. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks, Hanno, for this very kind introduction and invitation to this really excellent series of talks. And I also want to thank Amy for helping set this event up. So I'm just recovering from COVID, and so I hope that what I'll say will make some sense. I want to begin with a quote by David Theo Goldberg. He writes, "The sea here beyond the coastline and surface, the seeable and more or less noble, becomes increasingly the unknown, the opaque, the dark, the threatening. It has made the sight of monsters and monstrosity the racial of the natural world, and the bearer, the bringer, the transporter of the racial, of the outsider, the stranger, the strange, the necessarily unbelonging. As the racial of nature, the sea's other side, its underside, represents all the built-up fears about those racially characterized from the not here, monsters from elsewhere, shadows from places unknown and threatening in their unknowability." End quote. The Mediterranean Sea is a border zone where certain movements are racially coded while others are not. Certain types of vehicles are associated with the transportation of the racial, the stranger, the unbelonging, and associated with the violation of European space, while others clearly are not, or at least not per se. The rubber dinghy, the overcrowded wooden boat are vehicles that evoke associations that are very different to those evoked by merchant vessels, cruise ships, ferries, or yachts. So while you can see on vessel tracking sites such as this one, the latter roaming the Mediterranean non-stop as transporters of goods and of quote-unquote regular passengers, migrant boats that are not trackable, they transport the irregular. Moving precariously, they seem to evoke imaginaries of invasion, of threat, of despair, of contamination, and of unruliness. These imaginaries are, of course, always also racialized imaginaries, and they are part and parcel of European efforts to detain and contain particular people on the move. When we follow Ruth Gilmore's famous definition of racism as the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, then the Mediterranean border zone is one of the key sites where we can observe the production of premature death of certain racialized individuals and groups. Over 40,000 lives have been lost prematurely here since the 1990s, over half of them in just the last 7 years. And of course, this is a dramatic undercount. We will never know the exact figure of deaths and disappearances here. And so I always really caution against circulating official, quote unquote, official numbers without clearly stating as well that these are merely rough guesses. Just a few days ago, a shipwreck occurred off the coast of Libya, which no state authority or international organization has so far reported on. And so it is as if it had not occurred. So in my talk today, I want to highlight the governmental organization of carcerality and racial violence in the Mediterranean Sea. What happens at sea is not an unfortunate or fateful circumstance, but of course the outcome of restrictive migration policies and specific border enforcement strategies that have been designed and experimented with for decades. By looking at what I call offshore carcerality, especially since 2017 in the Central Mediterranean context, I also follow Claudio Aradao and Martina Tazzioli's suggestion to pay close attention to the specific political technologies that have emerged in the governance of migration and that create new distinctions and hierarchies of life. So the production of carceral assemblages at sea is, of course, always also the racialized production and reproduction of a hierarchy of the value of human lives. So in my talk, I will begin with a bit of context, pointing to the history of boat migration to Europe and to some significant developments over the past 11 years when the Arab uprisings first began. Following this necessarily sketchy contextualization, I will then turn to the situation in the Central Mediterranean region and highlight how offshore carcerality has come about and proliferated over recent years. And then, as a way of conclusion, I will discuss a couple of factors, and we can also then discuss this further in the discussion afterwards, that make the Mediterranean space not only one of death and disappearance, capture, abandonment, and so forth, but also one of continuous political contestation and conflict. Okay, to start with some context. Precarious maritime migration is, of course, not a new phenomenon. In the European context, we can regard the 1973 oil crisis and the hike of unemployment in several Western European countries as an important moment, which prompted more stringent and restrictive visa policies, especially for people from Northern Africa and Turkey, which in turn prompted the phenomenon of sea migration, precarious forms of sea migration in the first place. In the 1980s and 1990s, with the gradual consolidation of the freedom of mobility within the EU, immigration restrictions expanded and precarious maritime routes became more frequented. In the 2000s, especially when tens of thousands of people reached the Spanish Canary Islands in the Atlantic, crisis and emergency narratives that we have become so familiar with have become commonplace. And we can then also see more communalized forms of border enforcement. So at the time, the arrivals to the Spanish islands were not necessarily portrayed only as a sort of Spanish problem, but actually as a problem for the whole of the EU. And they would require a concerted EU response. So this response came, of course, in form of the EU border agency Frontex, which was created in the mid-2000s, which then also launched its first operation, Operation Hera, here in this area. Frontex naval assets and aerial assets started to patrol the West African coast. And here we can see already the communalizing, the externalizing, and the offshoring of EU border enforcement. In addition, in the 2000s, a range of bilateral agreements were concluded between EU member states and Northern African states, which led to the increasing criminalization of irregular exit and also the intensification of the persecution of human smuggling. And this applies to Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and also elsewhere. While maritime migration continued, and especially to Spain and Italy, it still remained in the low to mid tens of thousands for most of the 2000s, and it even decreased toward the end of that decade. So about 10,000 people reached Europe in 2010. So while there was a feeling at the time that, so in the late 2000s, that the governance of maritime migration was more or less working, something changed rather dramatically then in 2011, and we still feel the consequences today. The Arab uprisings in Tunisia and spreading beyond in Northern Africa and parts of the Middle East open migration corridors that had been heavily policed by Europe's post-colonial frontier guards before. With the fall of several North African regimes, in particular Tunisia and Libya, Europe's externalized border controls disintegrated as well. In 2011, especially young people from Tunisia and Libya, many of whom had participated in the revolutionary struggle, took to the boats. While many European politicians supported these pro-democratic uprisings in Northern Africa, welcoming these revolutionaries who came across the sea was a different matter. Many of them would also never arrive. So in 2011, we really see a spike in fatalities at sea. At least 1,500 people died that year. Then in the turmoil of the Arab uprisings, and of course also in light of the exodus then from Syria and its neighboring countries, we see an uptake in crossings, especially from 2014 on, when really unprecedented movements occurred across the sea, and these are figures for all the maritime regions. Between then and the end of 2021, over 2.2 million arrivals to Europe were recorded, while over 22,500 people are officially documented as having died or disappeared in this period. So we can clearly see that 2011 was a turning point and a start of a new phase of Mediterranean migration. And really, ever since the EU and its member states have experimented with forms of governments to more effectively police, deter, and contain these movements. And I will refer to some of these attempts to govern these movements in the Central Mediterranean region. So when we look plainly at the statistics of sea arrivals across the Central Mediterranean Sea, we see how arrivals in Italy and Malta stood at an annual average of about 23,000 between 1997 and 2010. So on this slide, you can still see the last 5 years of the 2000s. In 2011, as you can see, this figure doubled to about 64,000 arrivals. And then between 2014 and 2017, the average doubled again to about 156,000 arrivals. This then, and you can see this on the next slide here, was followed by a drastic decline between 2018 and 2020, with the annual average of arrivals dropping to approximately 25,000 people. And this is about the average number of arrivals before the Arab uprising started. It's worth noting that in the last years, in 21, figures have risen again to nearly exactly the figure a decade earlier in 2011. In view of this, sorry. So these changing figures, go back here for a second, they do tell a story. But I think we always need to be very cautious with them, with all statistics related to Mediterranean migration, because they're certainly not very precise, right? Especially the so-called autonomous or independent arrivals in Italy are often not accounted for. And also note that this table is a UNHCR table that is only for Italy, whereas the slide before was for Malta and Italy. Nonetheless, these figures do highlight how the increased crossings in the beginning of the decade indicate a rupture in the EU's maritime border regime, while the decrease toward the end of the decade highlight increasingly quote-unquote successful forms of border enforcement and deterrence policies. So in literatures on Mediterranean migration, a lot has been written about what Paolo Cutita has referred to as the humanitarian turn. So the increased rescue efforts in the early 2000s, especially by Italy in 2013 and 2014, which responded in particular to a harrowing shipwreck, it's this vessel, off the island of Lampedusa in October 2013, and mounting public pressure in Italy, also by the church, to do something about these desert sea. This Italian operation was called Mare Nostrum, as many of you know, which prompted the rescue of about 150,000 people to Italy, and it was interpreted by many as a sort of humanitarian operation driven by compassion. And so indeed, in light of this state-run operation, William Walter's concept of the humanitarian border has become quite popular. Walters highlighted a complex entanglement of rationales of security and humanitarian care in migration and border governance, which for him, I quote, signified a novel development within the history of borders and border making. So while security and humanitarian rationales, of course, continue to exist in a sort of awkward entanglement in the Mediterranean context, I don't really want to rehearse this already really well rehearsed debate on the coexistence of both security and humanitarian rationales. I want to focus on what happened really afterwards, after this short-lived Mare Nostrum operation. So Mare Nostrum was widely regarded as a so-called pull factor that would supposedly entice more individuals to make the crossing. And also because of this, it gave way to increasingly security-focused operations, such as Operation Triton, conducted by Frontex from 2014. So we can very roughly say that after Mare Nostrum, we see how this humanitarian-focused operation was not replaced by the EU, but we then see concerted European efforts to build what can be understood as a carceral regime at sea. At the time, many warned that this security focus would have severe consequences, not least as Operation Triton had a much reduced operational area than Mare Nostrum, as you can see here on this slide. The blue or purple is the operational zone of Frontex, Operation Triton. Even Frontex, in an internal document, assessed, I quote, that the withdrawal of naval assets from the area, if not properly planned and announced well in advance, will likely result in a higher number of fatalities. And this assessment was unfortunately correct. It created a rescue gap. Hundreds of people drowned. In 1 week in April 2015 alone, over 1,300 people drowned in 3 separate shipwrecks off the coast of Libya. In view of this spike of drownings, the EU naval operation UNAVFOR Med, Operation Sophia, was launched in May 2015. Though it was also characterized as a response to these drownings, it continued to emphasize border security. Its central aim was, I quote, to disrupt the business model of migrant smugglers and human traffickers in the southern Mediterranean Sea. So despite this security operation, those involved in this EU operation soon realized that it was quite difficult to avoid being drawn into rescue operations, right? Given the escalating conflict in Libya, the absence of Libyan assets, naval assets, the absence of a functioning rescue coordination center, the absence of a coast guard, and also due to the presence of non-state actors at sea observing UNOFORMED, this operation often felt forced into rescue operations, and then they had no other option really than to disembark the rescued in Europe. So we can certainly understand this operation to be a failure. It did not live up to its mandate or its aims to disrupt smuggling or to decrease arrivals in Europe, right? So in light of this failure then, EU authorities increased their efforts to design a regime of offshore carcerality that would lead to mass capture at sea and to contain escaping migrants elsewhere. So in order to understand the workings of this maritime carceral regime, I found concepts that have emerged from political geography and of course also carceral geographies really insightful and useful. Geographers Moran and colleagues have described our current age as an age of a carceral age. For them, this age is characterized, I quote, by unprecedented fluidity between forms of confinement, be they state-sanctioned, quasi-legal, ad hoc, illicit, spatially fixed, mobile, embodied, or imagined, and in which the scale of deployment of carceral techniques and infrastructures demands critical attention, end quote. Often inspired by the work of Foucault, who highlighted the diffusion of the carceral condition beyond the prison and throughout society, this scholarship has pointed to forms of carcerality that are often not static or necessarily hierarchical, but work through what Martin and colleagues call an assemblage of spatial practices. In particular, when inquiring about the governance of contemporary migration, we see how spatial practices and actors engaging in them have multiplied over recent years. Intending to police, to manage, and to order human movement, often from and through distance, these spatial practices have produced spaces of incarceration that are often themselves underscored by mobilities, as Jennifer Turner and Kimberly Peters have noted. And I think this is particularly true for the Mediterranean context. The Central Mediterranean, which is a really vast border zone, where we see mobile carceral strategies at work that are not delimited to specifically defined sovereign spaces of states. Migrant boats, such as this one escaping from the Libyan coast guards, they often have to navigate through spaces officially outside of the reach of any particular single state. When they leave from places such as Libya, they regularly pass not merely through territorial waters of states, but also through spaces defined by the United Nations, conventions of the law of the sea. They also have to navigate through search and rescue regions. They have to navigate through areas surveyed by temporary or more longer term military missions. And so we thus cannot really speak of a moment of border crossing, right? We rather have to think about it as a process of navigating an expanded border zone, which can take several days. This then also means that it requires a different spatial and temporal understanding of the border, not as a line that one can simply step over, but as a zone of overlapping and conflictual legal regimes. These overlaps and conflicts are not malfunctions, but rather structural characteristics of this maritime border zone, which has allowed EU states to simultaneously extend their sovereign privileges through forms of mobile governance and elude the responsibilities that supposedly come with that. So the governance of migration has prompted a carceral but mobile assemblage of spatial practices in the Central Mediterranean, and I want to quickly go through some of its key components. Central in all of this has been, of course, the legitimation of Libyan authorities as the competent authorities that are governing this maritime space outside the territorial waters. With EU military operations largely failing and doing what they were meant to do to reduce migrant arrivals in Europe, we see greater efforts to build up Libyan actors, especially from 2017 on, which is the year where we see a series of cooperation agreements between cooperation agreements that are really designed to fund and train Libyan forces. Libya's so-called integrated border management is funded in part by the EU's Trust Fund for Africa, but also through a range of bilateral agreements between EU member states and the Libyan authorities. The role of Italy and Italy's interior minister at the time on this picture here is really noteworthy. While the name Matteo Salvini might come to mind when we think about restrictive migration policies, it was really his predecessor, Marco Minniti, who drove the deals with Libyan militias that would come to play the role of legitimate Libyan coast guards. Given the bad reputation of these Libyan militias / coast guards, not least for engaging in migrant smuggling, migrant killing, migrant beating, also engaging in the threatening of civil rescuers, it was not sufficient for Europe to simply donate speedboats and to transfer funds to Libya. Efforts had to be undertaken to improve also the image of this Libyan force. And so we see how officers of EU operations such as Sophia or also Frontex carried out the training of these actors and to teach them how to respect human rights at sea. Then another crucial aspect in this sort of legitimation campaign is the creation of the maritime zone over which the Libyan unity government would hold geographical competence. In 2017, the Italian Coast Guard implemented a feasibility study, which was funded by the European Commission, to assess the Libyan capacity in the area of search and rescue. Shortly after the Libyan unity government declared this extensive Libyan search and rescue zone, and when very briefly they suspended the establishment of this search and rescue zone, given its inability to operate a maritime rescue coordination center, which is a pivotal aspect of that, Italy stepped in and sent an Italian naval vessel to Tripoli, where it would be moored in the harbor and where it would carry out the function of a Libyan maritime rescue coordination center. But this was not enough. In December last year, Italy deployed its naval helicopter carrier San Giorgio to secretly, or more or less secretly, deliver equipment to Tripoli, which would amount to a sort of mobile maritime rescue coordination center, financed by the EU. This is basically a MRCC in a box out of which Libyan authorities are supposed to coordinate migrant interceptions. Another crucial element in carceral maritime governance has been the strategic shift away from Europe's physical presence at sea and toward its presence in the skies through drones such as this one, Frontex drone. Migrant sightings from the air are relayed to Libyan officers, including also via WhatsApp or WhatsApp chats that include Frontex officers and Libyan officers, who would then send out Libyan speedboats, as you can see here, to catch escaping migrants. And what is interesting is that while the European actors appear to regard search and rescue boundaries as sort of quasi-hard territorial boundaries when it comes to migrants outside of them. Libyan speedboats are regularly invited deeply inside European, especially the Maltese search and rescue zone. And I think for questions also maybe later in the discussion around broad geographies and boundaries, we can also think about how these search and rescue zones, which are certainly not static or stable sovereign lines, have in some ways turned into this, at least from a sort of European perspective. So besides allowing Libyan assets into European search and rescue zones, the Maltese authorities in particular have also really found creative ways to justify delaying rescue operations and engaging in forms of non-assistance. So it's really worth noting that, unlike most other authorities, Malta considers an overcrowded migrant boat to not be in distress if they can still move, and if the people on board are not explicitly calling for rescue. Such clear requests for rescue, however, go quite often unheard because the so-called Rescue Coordination Center of Malta refuses to pick up its phones. And even when Maltese vessels are in the vicinity of migrant boats, this does not necessarily mean rescue. Activists who engage in counter-monitoring activities from the sky have told me repeatedly about really peculiar scenes where within the Maltese search and rescue area, Libyan assets would chase after migrant boats, while Maltese naval assets that are in the vicinity are themselves retreating, so in a way sort of fleeing, escaping the advancing migrants, doing everything they could to not be drawn into rescue operation. And so these are some of the patterns of aerial assets and drones that were captured by Sergio Scandura. Of course, another element in the production of carcerality at sea that needs mention is the blocking, the harassing, the obstructing of non-state rescues. And I don't really have much time to expand on this. I'm happy to discuss this later, but I think it's also very well known that EU member states have used a variety of strategies to block rescue vessels, to also misinform or at least not inform rescuers of migrant boats in distress, even if they are the closest asset nearby. We also see how migrant rescuers are often blocked from carrying out rescues, how humanitarians and activists have been repeatedly criminalized and so on. So I don't have really the time, I think, now to expand on this, but of course this is a crucial aspect of trying to get rid of those who would disembark, rescue and disembark people in Europe. So in, sorry, this is the slide of one of the rescuers who say that 8,714 humans have drowned since the confiscation of the EU Venta, which is one of the rescue assets. So in 21, over 32,000 people have been intercepted at sea and forced back to Libya, which is a record number of interceptions. And so we can see that this carceral regime seems to work, more or less. And it's also worth noting that those returned are then frequently sold by the Libyan forces at Libyan harbors to other actors who would then incarcerate them in informal or formal camps. And so clearly, this is also something I can't expand on, but it's important to note, offshore carcerality has to be connected to other forms of carcerality and carceral circuits on land as well. So when we look at this production of offshore carcerality over the past decade, we see how Europe has experimented with different forms of border enforcement, and it seems to now have found its recipe that works, at least to an extent. So Europe governs the sea through what geographers Maillet, Mounts, and Williams have referred to, I quote, imperio, a boundless, limitless, and administrative power, a power through which European actors mediate jurisdiction and legal protection by virtue of geography, and manipulate jurisdiction to suit political goals, end quote. So I think I'm running out of time. So just as a way of concluding, I do want to point to ongoing contestations and conflicts and forms of solidarity in the Central Mediterranean Sea. So despite this production of offshore carcerality, we quite obviously see that Europe's governance of maritime migration is always only an attempt to govern, right? And I've written about this elsewhere, also in the monograph that Hanno mentioned. And I focus especially on forms of migrant resistance and practice of solidarity. So I'm not going to expand on this much further, but just want to mention 3 points. First, as we can see also with the rise of arrivals again in the past year, people continue to escape and people continue to subvert the EU border regime, even if at ever greater risk to life. We have seen how people adapt their strategies of subverting border controls, for example, by taking smaller boats, by equipping themselves for longer periods of time at sea, for bringing more fuel, by using multiple engines that allow them to travel with greater speed and so to possibly escape from the Libyan coast guards. And so while it is often not mentioned, these autonomous arrivals, right, where people sort of arrive without being rescued by NGOs or by state actors, are a really significant factor in, you know, people managing to escape offshore carcerality. So according to the UNHCR, of the 34,000 people who reached Italy and Malta in 2022, only 4,500 of them were rescued by NGOs and state actors, right? The others arrived pretty much undetected until they were at the shore or very close to the shore. So while in public debates, in policy discussions, but also in much of mainstream migration research or studies, people on the move are often rendered to little more than desperate individuals who are sort of placed on these boats by smugglers without any agency. We can clearly see that they are not simply being pushed or pulled around, right? They often create migratory paths by moving. Second, when we look just 10 years back, I think none of us could have imagined that a few years later, dozens of NGO rescuers would roam the Mediterranean, that activists also from the network Alarm Phone, of which I'm a member, will receive distress calls directly from people at risk at sea, or that civil actors would conduct aerial missions to spot migrant boats at risk. And I think we cannot really overemphasize the importance of these interventions in really transforming the maritime border zone, right? And I also often think this is not sufficiently appreciated. And lastly, and related to the last point, we know how Europe's carceral regime functions only because of these interventions, and also due to the ever more dense collaborations between migrant communities and solidarity activists. And I've written in my book about forms of resistance, also as a form of analytic through which you can try to understand the workings and the functioning of the EU border regime. And I think this is exactly what we can see also in the Mediterranean, right? So due to this interplay between communities on the move and people in solidarity with them, we are able to document scenes like the ones you can see on this image, where people on a migrant boat captured with a smartphone these dangerous ways in which the armed force of Malta was navigating around this migrant boat in order to intimidate them and to return to Libya. It is also only through these collaborations between migrant communities and activists and humanitarians that we can see scenes like this, where a migrant boat in distress was rescued by a merchant vessel, but where the people were then abducted by the Libyan coast guards back to Libya. So whereas before we were sort of reliant on information shared by state actors about developments at sea, about deaths at sea. Now we have a much better understanding of how ongoing disasters at sea are not simply the outcome of unfortunate circumstances and events, but of actions and inactions taken by European and North African actors. And what we do with this knowledge really is up to all of us. Okay, so I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. It was really brilliant to talk to you and to hear your thoughts on all this. And thanks to the audience for asking all those really engaged questions. That's the end of our public seminar series. I hope everyone enjoyed the last couple of weeks and hopefully see you at future events, perhaps in person, perhaps online. Thank you very much and have a good evening.